might think that hashtag blessed means good things are going for you. You're having a good life. You're making it rain while walking your pet tiger because you just finished eating a salad made of $100 bills because you are hashtag blessed. That is not what we're talking about. Jesus has a very different definition of what it means to live a blessed life, to be blessed. And so for the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about this idea. And that's why we started this series, because we can't define ourselves, we can't define our successes the way the world defines successes. So if we truly want to be blessed, we have to line our lives up with what Jesus says the blessed life is, right? Thank you. That's good work back there, Ezra. All right, so in the first week, who remembers what we talked about? Blessed equals Luke? Oh, anybody remember? Needy. Oh, it's not even up there yet. Yeah, week number 1. Oh, no, you're right on back there, Aiden. You're right on. So, week 1, we said blessed equals needy. And a needy person is, Jesus said, poor in spirit. They mourn over sin, and they are meek, is the definition we looked at for a needy person. Who remembers last week? The second week, we said hashtag blessed equals. That was week 1. That was part of week 1. Anybody remember last week, the big idea? If you are blessed, then you realize you are what? Forgiven. Forgiven was week number 2. And we said that a forgiven person realizes that they have experienced Jesus' forgiveness. They have a desire to do right. They have a realization of their own sin. They're single-minded in their devotion to God. What did I talk about single-minded? I said it's like when you're hungry and someone gets pizza, right? You get single-minded. This week, we're going to wrap up this idea. So write this big idea down for tonight. If I am blessed, then I will be gracious. If I am blessed, then I will be gracious. So I'm not talking about the gracious person that offers their guest a drink. When someone comes to your house, you're like, can I get you some water? That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about a gracious person that might stand and hold the door for other people when everyone's coming in. I'm not talking about when you're maybe at the store and you let somebody else go in front of you, or in the lunch line at school and you let somebody else ahead of you. That's not the gracious person I'm talking about. Jesus gives us a definition of a gracious person that goes a lot deeper than that. So write this first idea. He gives us 3 characteristics of a gracious person. First one is this: gracious equals peacemaker. Gracious equals peacemaker. And I'm not talking about like a big Colt 45 from the old West movies, the big peacemaker, gun. That's what I'm not talking about. Jesus says in Matthew 5:9, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. How many of you want to be called a child of God? Then Jesus says that you are a what? Peacemaker. Why is that important? Why is a peacemaker someone that's a child of God? Well, Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6, there's a prophecy about Jesus, and part of that prophecy is that Jesus will be the Prince of Peace. Jesus will rule and reign over peace, right? Right, back row? Yes? Yes, okay. So, if we are followers of Christ, then guess what we get to experience in our lives when we know that Jesus is in control? We get peace. Right, we get peace because when we are in fellowship with Jesus, when we know Jesus is our Savior, that means we're made right with God and we are no longer enemies of God or at war with God. We have peace with God, right? And so we should live at peace with each other, right? Because Jesus is the Prince of Peace. If we're at peace with God, we should live at peace with one another. We should extend this whole idea of peace to other people by introducing them to Jesus, who can give them the ultimate peace, right? Because he's the Prince of Peace. So Jesus is God's Son. He is called the Prince of Peace. And if you and I are peacemakers, then we are acting like Jesus. We're acting like children of God, right? So Jesus says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Let me ask you this. Are you concerned with bringing other people into this peace of God? Are you concerned with bringing peace into other people's life? or are you constantly striving? If you are bringing peace to other people, then you're acting like Jesus. So, first point, gracious equals peacemaker. There we go. Perfect. Yes. All right. Number 2, write this down. Gracious equals mistreated. How many of you guys have ever been mistreated? Yeah, probably most of us in this room. Listen to what Jesus says in Matthew 5, verse 10. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to them. How many of you guys have seen like God's Not Dead 1 or 2? Anybody? There's an example of people that are persecuted for. Remember last week we said righteousness is what? Doing right. Doing the right thing. Doing right. And so if you are persecuted because you're doing the right thing, then Jesus says the kingdom of heaven belongs to you and you're blessed. Now, how many of you have gotten in trouble for doing the wrong thing? That's not what we're talking about. You can get in trouble for doing the wrong thing, and it is not being persecuted for righteousness. Jesus says righteousness is doing the right thing, so if you're living God's way, you're an heir to his kingdom. But why would you be persecuted for doing the right thing? Well, I found this pretty straightforward definition. It says the world does not give up its hates and self-centered living easily. This brings opposition on disciples of Christ. Righteous people, those whose conduct is right in God's eyes, become targets of the unrighteous. And so that's kind of what we see if you've seen those movies, God's Not Dead or God's Not Dead 2. Somebody that wants to stand up for doing right or wants to say, yes, I believe in God and I believe that God created everything that we know and that evolution isn't real and that your philosophy doesn't really make any sense because you're taking God out of the equation and that's what I believe and you want to persecute me for that. Well, Jesus says that is bound to happen because if you're living as light, right? A few weeks ago we talked about you're a city on a hill that cannot be hidden. You're the light of the world. You don't hide your light under a bowl. You put it on a stand so everybody can see, right? So if you're living this light life that Jesus is talking about, you are living as light. There are some people that just want to stay in darkness. And if somebody is so wrapped up in themselves, if they don't care about what God has to say for their life, then if you are shining your light into their life, then you're exposing what they want to try and keep hidden. And what happens if you expose something that somebody's trying to keep hidden? Somebody's got a dirty secret. You guys heard the term a skeleton in their closet. They don't want anybody to know about this stuff. And everybody finds out, what do? They want to punch you in the face. They want to get mad at you. They want to cuss you out or yell at you. Well, that's what happens when people that don't want to change are confronted with the light of God. Their sin is exposed, and then they will react negatively against you. So, are you living in a way that people are convicted of their sin? Or are we just fitting right in? The big question is, are you allowing Jesus to shine through you? Because when you allow Jesus to shine through you, his light is going to expose some things in people that they don't want exposed. And the natural reaction is they're going to persecute you. This goes into the third part. Gracious equals Christ-like. So this idea of being persecuted for doing right, mistreated, the ultimate example of that we see is Jesus himself, right? He says this in verse 11, "Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and say all kinds of evil things about you falsely on account of me." Now that's the big important thing. If you're doing wrong and people are saying stuff about you because you're not living right, is that what Jesus is talking about? No, he's talking about people that want to try and accuse you of stuff that you didn't do. They falsely accuse you. And he says that you're blessed when you live such a way that the only thing people can do is make up stuff about you to try and bring you down. Does that make sense? You're living like Jesus so much that the only recourse people have against you is that they're going to try and make up junk to falsely accuse you to try and make you look bad in front of other people. But if you're living right, is it going to stick? No, it's not going to stick. You're blessed basically when you act like Jesus. Here's what people said about Jesus. They said Jesus was a liar. They said Jesus was demon-possessed. They said he was a crazy man. They said he was like a rebel. He was a problem causer and all this other stuff that they just heaped these accusations up on Jesus. They said he was a lawbreaker. They didn't have any concern for the temple or God or Moses or the law. And so did any of that stuff really happen? Was Jesus any of those things? No, he wasn't any of those things. He was exact opposite of what those things were. But here's the thing. We don't see Jesus getting mad. We don't see Jesus getting in fights. We don't see Jesus trying to sue people for libel or falsehoods against him. He didn't do any of that. He lived his life. He was an example to us that when we are living right and people might make up stuff against us, then we're in pretty good company because they did the same thing to Jesus. And he expands on this idea in verse 12. And it says this, rejoice and be glad. Now that doesn't make any sense. People are lying about you, but Jesus says be happy about it. Rejoice about it. Does that make any sense? No, it makes zero sense. Rejoice and be glad because your reward is great in heaven, for they persecuted the prophets before you in the same way. In other words, Jesus says you're in really good company if you're living this kind of life, because not only are they saying that stuff about me, but they said it about prophets who were God's voice. In other words, these were people that heard directly from God, and God chose them to speak to nations. And they would say all kinds of false things about him. They would imprison him. They would beat him up. They would kill him oftentimes. But Jesus says you're in good company because these people were used by God and they trusted God even into their death. They relied on God. So if people mistreat you, if people lie about you for being a Christian, then you're in good company because it's the same way with the prophets and it was the same way with Jesus. If you're doing right even when people treat you wrong, then you're living as a gracious person. And God has a reward waiting for you. Right? That's what he says, that your reward in heaven is great if you live this gracious life. Now the question is, will you choose to be gracious and trust in God's timing? Will you choose to be gracious and trust in God's timing? Even if people say wrong things about you, will you respond with grace to them? If people lie about you, will you extend the mercy and love of Jesus back to them, or will you retaliate? Jesus says a blessed life is someone that lives a gracious life, that's willing to be mistreated for the sake of Jesus. This person is willing to do whatever they can to bring peace into situations instead of stirring up trouble. And really, this gracious life we see exemplified in Jesus. We're Christ-like. So in these few verses of Matthew 5, a blessed life, we said week 1, is a needy person. Someone that's poor in spirit realizes that they need God. Someone that is needy is realizing that sin brings death, so they're mournful over sin. Someone that is needy is blessed because they live as meek. They have strength that is under control. Last week we said that the blessed life is someone that is forgiven. They have a desire to do right. You have a realization of your own sin, and so you aren't going to come against other people for their shortcomings because you know that you yourself have fallen short. This forgiven person has a single-minded devotion to God, and Jesus says that person is blessed. This week we said the blessed life is a gracious person, someone that is a peacemaker, someone that is willing to be mistreated for the sake of Jesus, someone that will live Christ-like. In other words, Jesus is my ultimate example, and I'm going to model my life to match him. The last question I have is this: are you living a blessed life the way Jesus says a blessed life is? Are you living as someone that is needy, that is forgiven, and that is gracious? Because Jesus says that's what it is. And if you're not, what needs to change? What has to be different so that you can line up your life? Let's pray tonight.